I am Luis Martinez Fernandez, Professor of History at the University of Central Florida, and you're listening to the RICHES Documentary Podcast.
Ocala,
Taveras,
Daytona Beach,
Oviedo,
Apopka,
Orlando,
Lake Helen,
Winter Park,
Eustis,
Sanford.
Welcome to the RICHES Documentary Podcast. RICHES, the regional initiative for collecting the histories, experience, and stories of Central Florida, is an umbrella program housing interdisciplinary public history projects that bring together different departments at the University of Central Florida with profit and nonprofit sectors of the community in order to promote the collection and preservation of the region's history. By facilitating research that records and presents the stories of communities, businesses, and institutions in Central Florida, RICHES seeks to provide the region with a deeper sense of its heritage. This series will feature a podcast every 2 weeks, in the middle and at the end of each month, that will explore various aspects of Central Florida history. In today's episode, the construction of inequality, politics, and influence on I-4, we examine the controversy over the construction of Interstate 4 through and around Orlando and the unequal amount of influence exerted on the building of the road by different interest groups and parties involved. The Orlando Business District, the Paramore community, and the city of Winter Park each have a part in this story.
Welcome back, listeners, to another historical podcast with Derek Ermensdorfer. The topic of today's podcast is the construction of Interstate 4 and the controversy surrounding it. I have brought in 4 speakers to give us their insight on the situation and to add historical context from similar situations in other urban centers outside of Orlando. The first person I talked to was Dr. Julian Chambliss. Chambliss is an associate professor of history at Rollins College, who also serves as the coordinator of African American Studies. His research specialty is urban development and planning history in the 19th and 20th centuries. I asked Dr. Chambliss if he could give us a background on I-4, the Paramore community of Orlando, and the city of Winter Park.
Well, when we talk about the construction of major highways in the sort of beginning in the late 50s, early 60s, that is really connected to a long process of urban development patterns that have a disproportionate disruptive effect on communities of ethnic and racial minorities. And this is a fairly complicated story, and there's a lot of literature that sort of like covers the story, but in brief, the particular case of Central Florida and I-4 construction, so Paramore and Winter Park are at opposite ends of that spectrum, as you say. But if you sort of step back and think about this from the sort of national perspective, if we look at development of major infrastructure projects in the United States, almost from the turn of the century, like literally 1900, moving forward, there is a pattern of particular opportunities being taken to reimagine or reconstruct spaces that are usually associated with minority groups. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the initial wave of civic improvement activity in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, which is one of the primary areas that I look at, the City Beautiful movement, which is usually associated with this period, if you look at the sort of effort to reorganize and clarify movement in and out of Central Business District, which is a big part of those big plans, those spaces that were most in question tended to be older immigrant neighborhoods. And if you look at the street widening or the beautification efforts to get rid of bad constructions, those tend to be tenements in big industrial cities. Those tend to be African American neighborhoods that were sort of locked because of segregation into these sort of like highly dense packed spaces. These places were prey to very degraded housing stock. They were not developed in any way, shape, or form that would be similar to other parts of the community, in part because the way that the whole marketplace in terms of real estate was constructed, it was better to be sort of white and sort of upperly mobile versus sort of being ethnic. And so there's a lot of classic literature that sort of talks about this question of when real estate developers and real estate appraisers are going out and looking at communities, they literally had a sort of race-based system that factored into how they looked at urban spaces.
Later, I asked Dr. Chambliss what he thought of the notion that Paramore and Winter Park had different outcomes, because Paramore is a community and Winter Park is a city.
Yeah, I think that the emphasis that since it's a town is misleading in the sense that, yes, a town has a definitive sort of like identity, but Eatonville is a town, and like Eatonville is basically bisected by I-4, right? And so how is it that Eatonville, which is the oldest African American incorporated city in the United States, clearly they would have taken umbrage with the idea of like, well, we're going to cut through the middle of your town, and they didn't seem to be able to like marshal the resources. And there are plenty of examples of towns that are affluent versus towns that are poor, regardless of race, where like the affluent community, like you look at a place like Greensboro, North Carolina, like the way the highway basically goes around downtown was because like the people there were like, no. And you look at similar small communities like Winter Park, but you look at similar small communities around there, the lower income town with the sort of like tax base and not the same sort of political connections, it's really difficult for them to effectively do that. I mean, there's no question that the placement of I-4 is good in terms of maintaining the integrity of the Winter Park community. And the argument made for why you need to maintain the integrity of the Winter Park community is layered with these sort of like social spatial assumptions.
The next person I talked with was Dr. Jim Clark. Dr. Clark is on the faculty at the University of Central Florida in the history department. He teaches Florida history and the second half of United States history. Since it fit right into his field of study, I asked Dr. Clark if he wouldn't mind giving us a background on I-4 and why it was built the way it was in Orlando.
Interstate 4 is an amazing venture. President Eisenhower creates the Interstate Highway system and pushes it not as a highway system for you and I, but rather as a defense system in case of war to be able to move things quickly. In fact, you still find old signs along the side of interstates that have not been enlarged that call it the National Defense Highway. And of course, it's 40,000 miles now, and it comes to different areas, of course, at different times. And I-4 was a project in the 1960s. As you know, even-numbered highways run east and west, and odd-numbered highways run north and south. And so the federal government came to Orlando, and their idea was to create what would have become a kind of beltway, that I-4 would skirt the outer fringes of Orlando, and then the people of Orlando would build roads connecting it to downtown or Florida. Instead, local business leaders led by the Orlando Sentinel were outraged by the federal proposal. They wanted it built through downtown Orlando to accomplish several things. First of all, to connect downtown, to help the businesses downtown by bringing in people, making it easier for people to shop in downtown Orlando. Stores in downtown Orlando were kind of on the decline. At the time, there was a JCPenney store downtown. There were a couple department stores downtown. So it had been a vibrant downtown, but by now it's beginning to move out into what will become malls. So they wanted that run right through downtown Orlando. They also wanted, in an era where civil rights was becoming a major issue, to carve out a major dividing line between the black neighborhood and the white neighborhood. With integration coming, they were concerned that blacks would begin migrating from the Paramore area over into white areas, and people assumed that I-4 was always there. Of course, it wasn't, and scores of homes and businesses were torn down to make room for I-4 through downtown Orlando. But it created this huge obstacle between the black neighborhoods and the white neighborhoods, which still exists today.
I mentioned to Dr. Clark that both Paramore and Winter Park are involved in the I-4 controversy. I asked him why he thought the outcomes were different for the two groups.
I think that the highway was geared to go through black neighborhoods. There's a crook in the road in downtown Orlando where the entranceway is to the East-West Expressway, and that has become a major obstacle for traffic jams, and yet it was designed that way to help property owners. This was very much a highway conceived by local merchants. There's an on-ramp going eastbound on I-4, which was set up to serve the Orlando Sentinel so that its trucks could simply go down this little brick street and get on the on-ramp. I mean, if you look at other cities that think that a 2-lane brick road is going to have its own on-ramp sounds preposterous, but that's exactly what happened. Meanwhile, the idea was, of course, to keep this away from Winter Park. And you had this in a lot of wealthy neighborhoods where people didn't want the interstate either coming through their neighborhoods or, frankly, they worried about on and off ramps. This is a problem of transit in our country. For example, Georgetown, the very exclusive section of Washington, D.C., passed on the subway, the Washington subway, because they were concerned it would bring in the riffraff. So there's no subway stop there.
It's a pain to get to Georgetown.
And it's a pain to get to Georgetown. You're absolutely right. And so Winter Park, the highway kind of avoided Winter Park and skirts it, and it serves Winter Park without the concern of, again, kind of bringing undesirable people. You're seeing this today with high-speed rail, that some merchants are concerned that it will bring undesirables into their town, not paying customers.
I was also able to get in touch with Dr. Bruce Stevenson by phone for a quick interview. Dr. Stevenson has worked for the last 30 years as a planner, consultant, or as a professor. He is currently directing a Master's of Planning degree in Civic Urbanism, which focuses on retrofitting suburban areas for smart growth. Having worked in the field for so long, I figured that Dr. Stevenson would know a lot about the I-4 situation. I asked him what the factors were that led to putting in a highway through an urban area.
Most times highways are put in places where people don't want to live or where values are low. I mean, that's historically what's happened, but I think what's interesting is it's pretty hard to find, maybe outside the Boston Big Dig, but that's really a retrofit where many new highways have been put into urban areas or urban neighborhoods.
I then asked him why he thought a place like Paramore was chosen as a location for I-4 to go through Orlando.
It's pretty basic, and I think, you could almost read Robert Caro's book on Robert Moses, who was the great highway builder that kind of set the template for all this. And, Paramore is, because it's an African-American neighborhood, it lacked political power in the 1950s and 60s. It was, the designation for I-4. And also, if you look at it, it was literally on the other side of the tracks. And I think today Paramore is almost entirely encircled by I-4 ramps and various other intense freeway construction.
I followed up by asking him if what we see in Paramore is a common pattern in urban settings.
Areas where you have low property values also tend to have low income and have low political input. So I think it's a combination of one or the other. It's kind of the chicken or the egg. Historically, the poorest neighborhoods are usually are more flood prone or near sewage disposal or near large plants or incinerators. And so it's I don't know whether it's market driven or politically driven, but the poorest, most powerless people usually have the least say in what goes on around them.
The last person I spoke with for this podcast was Dr. Raymond Mole. Dr. Mole is a history professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. His field is U.S. urban history, and he's been writing for many years now about the impact of interstates on cities. He's currently working on a book which is to be titled The Interstates and the Cities. The situation in Orlando concerning I-4 is part of a larger whole, and it goes back to the 1950s, if not sooner. In order to get some wider context on this situation as we close the discussion, I asked Dr. Mole if he wouldn't mind telling us about the back and forth that went on between highway engineers and urban planners when interstates like I-4 were first being constructed.
There was a lot of controversy over where those routes were located, the kind of massive destruction that would be required in the central cities as they penetrated through neighborhoods and historic districts or parks or sometimes even higher-end properties. But mostly it was lower class, working class, white, ethnic, and black neighborhoods that were on the block here. So already by 1960, not much had been built yet, but there was an emerging dispute between the highway engineers and the city and regional planners. The planners were saying, hey, these interstates are great, but we need to have real planning. And the highway engineers said, we build highways, we know what we're doing. Now the controversy was over the fact that the highway engineers were concerned, yes, they knew how to build highways, and usually they were trying to build them in the most efficient ways to move traffic between point A and point B, usually in a straight line, and whatever it was in the way, that was too bad. It was someone else's problem. So there was that kind of planning. There was a highway engineering mindset that they were the experts, they knew what they were doing, so that was it. The city and regional planners say, yes, we need these highways, but we need to consider the planning of them in a much larger context, not just an engineering concept, not just a traffic or transportation or automobile movement kind of a way, but to consider the larger pattern of land usage, of potential urbanization, consider the housing problem that was being created by the penetrating the central cities and destroying neighborhoods. So there was a big controversy going on between the city planners, who had a larger conception in mind, and the highway engineers, who had a single-minded objective to build highways between point A and point B and to move traffic more efficiently.
Dr. Mole has done studies on the effects of Interstate 95 on the city of Miami. So I asked him if he could give us a brief rundown of how construction there affected the African American or white ethnic communities, as a useful comparison for the construction of I-4 through the Paramore community in the city of Orlando.
Where Interstate 95 had a devastating effect when it was built. The urban expressway part of Interstate 95 was built into downtown Miami in the mid-60s. And they followed a route, essentially, that was laid out by the State Highway Department with the input of local civic leaders, political and business leaders. Interstate 95 came north-south into downtown Miami, and it traversed the major black community called Overtown, a large community of between 30 and 40,000 people at that time. And it went right through the main black business district. And there was a huge downtown interchange that connected I-95 with what later became known as I-395, an east-west expressway that connected Miami Beach with western Dade County. That big interchange alone destroyed the housing of about, maybe 10,000 people. And there was lots more other destruction as well, and some urban renewal taking place in that area. Taken together, those two programs wiped out much of Overtown and destroyed its centrality as a black community and all of the businesses, the professionals, the cultural things going on there, and forced a relocation of people into other parts of Dade County.
So as we see, the story and controversy surrounding I-4 is similar to situations in other cities and with other interstates. I would like to thank all the doctors, Chambliss, Clark, Stevenson, and Mole, for assisting me with this podcast by giving up their precious time to be interviewed, and I want to thank you listeners for stopping in to listen. If you'd like to know more about this subject, there's plenty of literature available, and I would highly recommend any articles written by the aforementioned professors.
Thank you for listening to the Riches Documentary Podcast. Feel free to contact us with any question or comments on the program that you just heard. Please join us for the next episode, Remembering Orlando, an interview with Joy Wallace Dickinson, Part 1.
Tells me. Palm Bay,
Geneva.
Huddersfield, Vero Beach,
Dunellen,